Good morning to those who are joining us live on Zoom right now, and greetings to those who are finding this recording later on online. My name is Matthew Kieswetter. I'm president of the Trinity College Divinity Associates executive. I'm a 2016 grad of the MDiv program, and I'm a parish priest in Kitchener, Ontario. So if you go out to see the Blackberry movie that's coming out shortly in theaters, that's like literally set in my backyard. Well, just past my backyard in Waterloo. The timing of this online conference I find particularly intriguing, occurring as it does just days after King Charles's coronation. Interesting how some churches have seen it as a missional opportunity to hopefully connect with their wider community, offering receptions or evensong services. Well, there are other Anglicans who may hold political theologies that lead to a desire, say, for more of a distancing between church and crown. Noted that Bosco Peters, on his popular New Zealand-based liturgy blog, characterized the coronation as an excellent example of Anglicanism as Protestant software running on Catholic hardware. So we have a morning and an afternoon session today with slightly different foci, but all related in some way to our topic of colonialism and the Anglican Church. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Acting Dean of Divinity, Marcia Hewitt.
Thank you, Matthew, and hello, everyone. Greetings. It's lovely to see you all. I'm still in a very happy state 2 days after our convocation, which is relevant here given the theme of the conference today, Colonialism and the Anglican Church. It's just so interesting how what you are doing and the issues you're going to be discussing today that you have chosen, I'm so pleased that you have to focus on, aligns so well, not only with our convocation and our featured honorary degree recipient to address convocation, Archbishop Fred Hiltz. Remember him, the famous Nothing Good letter of 2017, and his public remarks on this topic. And then what we've been doing in the Faculty of Divinity all year with our Reimagining Contemporary Ministries initiative, where we as a faculty are committed to and in the process of looking at, examining, and transforming our curriculum in ways that acknowledge and address this issue and the very, very hard questions that is raised. So that's an ongoing project that we're committed to, and it's really wonderful to see that we have this this alignment happening. It's a very long road of repair that demands so much of us in terms of recognizing, confronting our past, and the ways in which we have been as a church and church community implicated in colonialism and racist practices and so on. But at the same time, as we do that, I think it's also extremely important, and I think you're going to be doing that from the description of the conference, to also look at the resources that are also there, the resources for that repair leading toward reconciliation. They are there. They are there. It's not like we have to, scrap our traditions and invent something new. They are there. And so the issue is how to unearth them and unleash them for a renewed church, and that is relevant to confronting and dealing with these issues. So I'm really happy that you are doing that and that we are on the same page, as it were, in our work in the Faculty of Divinity. I'm very sorry that I won't be able to stay with you today. Many months ago, I was invited to and agreed to participate in a conference that's happening right now in Houston, Texas. So I will be there for the next 3 days. But I'll be thinking of you and wish you well. And I know this promises to be a very rich and very rewarding and very important conference. At this point, I will read the land acknowledgement before I bid you farewell. We acknowledge that the land on which Trinity College and the University of Toronto operate, is part of the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit and Anishinaabe people, land covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge the stewardship of this land by First Nations, the continuing presence here of Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and the harm caused by colonialism. We commit ourselves to seeking a new and honorable relationship with the First Peoples of this land. Thank you all very, very much for being here and for choosing this topic to dwell into. And I bid you farewell and all the best for a very rich and satisfying day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, one of the revelations of the last few years has been how in some way we can collapse great distances via Zoom. So it's a real pleasure that today we're connecting with Lambeth Palace as part of our 2023 Divinity Associates Conference. We're able to do so by way of Christoph Adamiak, who has been serving as an archivist at the Lambeth Palace Library since 2007. With responsibility for archival collections dating between the 1830s and the 1990s, and also with responsibility for the library's reprographics and digitization services. Christoph also curated the recent exhibition Enslavement Voices from the Archives that he will be sharing with us today. And responding to what we'll see and hear in that exhibition, and speaking from his own experience and perspective, and helping connect the themes of the exhibition to us here in Canada, I'm honored to introduce Bishop Peter Fenty. Born in Barbados and ordained there in 1975, Bishop Fenty became rector of St. Lawrence Church in the Diocese of Montreal in 1992, and later served in parish ministry in the Diocese of Toronto starting in 1997, and was consecrated bishop in 2013 with oversight of the York Simcoe Episcopal area. Following the presentation and reflections from our speakers, I'm pleased that relatively recent Trinity graduate and now priest in the beautiful beaches part of Toronto, Johan de Pella, will moderate a Q&A portion of our time together. We want to engage the audience, so please write in your questions to the Zoom Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, where those questions will get to Johan. Note that for clarity or elaboration, Johan may call on you, and if so, simply unmute your microphone. It might take a moment for us at this end to toggle a setting as well, so it might take just a brief moment. And now we'll begin with our glimpse into the Lambeth exhibition facilitated by Christoph. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you all. And thank you for the interest in the exhibition. I'll very briefly, very shortly, will share a screen with you all and then present the highlights from the exhibition. I wasn't able to include every single item, but whoever would be interested, I'm more than happy to share the transcripts and images later. So please feel free to contact me via Andrea, I believe. I'll share a screen and then please let me know if you can see it.
Yes, that's coming through.
Yeah. So the exhibition's title was Enslavement Voices from the Archive, and the exhibition was held at the library between January and April this year. But before I move onto the exhibition, I just like to tell you a few words about the library itself. So we like to call ourselves an old and new library, because the library originally, the old library, was founded in 1610 by the will of Archbishop Bancroft, and it was one of the first public libraries in Britain. And it remained on site of the Lambeth Palace old buildings until 2020, when it moved to the new building, and you can see the building on the photographs here. So it's located centrally, just across the river from the Houses of Parliament. And as you can see, it's a very simple brick building. However, we are very, very pleased that it's the first time in the history of the library it houses the collections in environment that's properly managed and monitored. So we can manage the relative temperature and humidity, allowing the preservation of the collections. We've got access to the garden, and just to boast a little bit, a very nice view of the Houses of Parliament from the terrace and conference room, which I hope maybe at some point in the future you'll be coming over and maybe holding a conference here. We've got the reading room for 24 people, and then on the right hand side you can see just a view of the typical storage area. What we also boast with is a conservation studio. This is a really big progress for the library, because we are able now to conserve and preserve the items on site. And we've got a very skilled team of wonderful conservators that fix the items that got damaged with the passing of time. In terms of the collections, very briefly, they range from the 9th century, starting in the 9th century illuminated manuscripts, like the one on the left, Magdalene Gospel, through early modern material. For instance, the image in the middle you can see is the death warrant for the Mary Queen of Scots. And then on the right hand side, it's a page from the private prayer book of Queen Elizabeth I. But we also have more modern records, like church plans, quite huge photographic archive, and then a big collection of maps illustrating the estates held by the church. I mean, we are quite modern. We are using online archives, electronic archives catalog, but to some extent we still have to rely on the old-fashioned card indexes. As you can see, they are still in use, and they are a key to our collections. So everyone is welcome to use our collections. At the end of the presentation, I'll provide some links. I hope you will find a rich resource for your own research by searching our online catalogs, both for printed books and the archives catalog as well. And we also have online image bank where the digitized items from the collections are being constantly added, so you can browse some of the archives there without coming to London. So let's maybe move to the exhibition. It was the way it came about was because of the Church Commissioner's research into its historic links to transatlantic slavery. And the first research was commissioned in 2019 when myself and my colleague, we were commissioned to look at some of the archives of the Church Commissioner's predecessor bodies in shape of ecclesiastical commissioners and Queen's Own Bounty. They both merged in 1948 to form the present Church Commissioners. So we looked at the financial records, and then looking at the ecclesiastical commissioners, which was a body that was created in the 1830s, we didn't really find much. But looking at the financial records of Queen's Own Bounty, which was a fund created in 1704 to fund augmentation of living of the poorer clergy, some links or direct and indirect links to the transatlantic chattels slave trade were discovered in shape of investments of the Queen's Own Bounty in the South Sea Company, and also direct benefactions from individuals that were involved in the slave trade. Following that, the commissioners commissioned a forensic accountancy company called Grant Thornton to do the more detailed research. They had to go through the accounts. That was quite unusual for them, because normally they deal with more modern records. So what they did, they extracted the data from the ledgers, and then moved them into the Excel spreadsheets, and then did the research based on that. And they proved that, again, quite a lot of resources, financial resources of the Queen's Own Bounty were gained from investment in the South Sea Company. This led to publication of the report in December, full report on the links of the Church Commissioner's predecessor bodies into the transatlantic slave trade. And there you can see on the on that slide the response of the Archbishop of Canterbury. I believe my colleague Georgia, who's the Director of Engagement and Planning of the Commissioners, will be joining us for the question and answer sessions later. So you can ask her about if you're interested into the further plans. But what has been allocated is a 100 million fund that is going to probably invest and provide funds for engagement and research to address the wrongdoings of the transatlantic slave. But I believe Georgia can say much more about it. This is the entrance hall where the exhibition was held. At that time, we only had 4 cases, so I really had to limit myself with a selection of items. What I'm going to show you now is just a few of them that I think were the most interesting and maybe telling. I'm also going to share play a sound clips of recordings of voicing of those documents. We tried to create sort of an exhibition that wouldn't be only a display of documents. People were also able to listen to the recordings and read transcriptions. So I'll try to make it as interactive as possible for you as well. Just a brief introduction to those of you who might not be familiar with transatlantic slavery economy. Just a few words about it. It relied basically on upon the enslavement and transportation of people from Western Africa to grow sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton crops on the large plantations in Caribbean and the Americas. The rationale given for the enslavement of African and indigenous people was rooted in early racism and also economic need. So racism promoted the idea that non-Europeans were inferior to Europeans, therefore they could be treated as chattel, basically a property to be bought, sold, and inherited by the enslavers. The role of the Church of England in the transatlantic slavery economy was complex and varied. On one hand, missionaries were sent to work in the Caribbean and the Americas, and they documented the harsh conditions of daily life on the plantations. Enslaved people were not allowed basic Christian rights, such as baptism and marriage, and in case these rights damage the property and legal rights of the owners. So some voices were raised against it. For instance, Reverend Morgan Godwin, who was an Anglican missionary to Virginia and Barbados. I'll tell a little bit more about him later, but that was an early case. It was 1680s. Whereas the first English slave trading expedition was led in 1560s, and then it gradually developed throughout the 17th century. For instance, and then deep into 18th century. So between 1680s and 1680 and 1686, a company called the Royal African Company transported around 5,000 enslaved annually. In 1760s, for instance, a total of 146 ships with capacity for 36,000 persons sailed from British ports to Africa and from there to Caribbean and America. An average slave ship could contain up to 400 enslaved plus 30 crew members, and the conditions of travel and diseases of these terrible voyages led to an average mortality rate of 15 to 20%. Those who survived would then be sold either at an auction or directly from the ship for a price averaging between 29 to 60 pounds per person. That was then money. So in current money, it's about 2,500, 5,000 pounds. And then they were destined to work in the plantation. A lot of cases were that the families were split in that process. And then the life on plantation was equally atrocious. There was hard work for up to 18 hours a day, accommodation in small thatched roof huts with almost no furniture, and then there was a complete control by white masters of almost every aspect of the enslaved lives. In general, the transatlantic slave trade had a profound impact on the lives of people in the trade triangle. I'll just show you how it all worked. So you would be moving the cotton, sugar, and then other produces to England, and from England the ships would go to West Africa, and then from West Africa back to America. So it was a triangle. It all changed profoundly the lives of people involved. It is estimated that of 12 million Africans dispatched to the New World between 1500 and 1800, around 10 million, only around 10 million reached the destination. Indigenous American population was virtually wiped out as a result of wars, slavery, and diseases, and the effects are visible to this very day. This illustration shows a diagram of a slave ship. It's quite popular, probably some of you might be familiar with it. That's ship Brooks that transported enslaved people between 1781 and 84. So that capacity was 490 tightly packed people on board. I'll try to enlarge it. I think now you can see more precisely how it looked. And then to introduce you to first of the items that was on display, this is a letter from 1723 that was bound into the papers of the bishops of London that we also have the archives of. They're called Fulham Papers. That's because the residence of the bishops of London was Fulham Palace. It was sent from Virginia, and it's one of the earliest no pleas for freedom by an enslaved person. We assume that it was created in secrecy over a period of a month, and then our conservators said that it was probably the person was using, or persons were using a homemade ink. The fact that it was addressed to the Lord Archbishop of London demonstrates that some of the enslaved people were addressing their protests and pleas beyond those that they were forced to serve. I'll play you a sound clip, the reading of that letter. So hoping that this conveys the whole plea more precisely than me just talking about it.
August the 4th, 1723. To the Right Reverend Father in God, my Lord Archbishop of Lond, this comes to satisfy your honour that there is in this land of Virginia a sort of people that is called mulattoes, which are baptized and brought up in the way of the Christian faith, and follows the ways and rules of the Church of England. And some of them has white fathers, and some white mothers. And there is in this land a law or act which keeps and makes them and their seed slaves forever. And most honoured Sir, amongst the rest of your charitable acts and deed, we, your humble and poor partitioners, do beg, Sir, your aid and assistance in this one thing, which lies, as I do understand, in your lordship's breast, which is that your honour will, by the help of our sovereign Lord King George and the rest of the rulers, will release us out of this cruel bondage. And this we beg for Jesus Christ's, his sake, who has commanded us to seek first the kingdom of God, and all things shall be added unto us. And here it is to be noted that one brother is a slave to another, and one sister to another, which is quite out of the way. And as for me, myself, I am my brother's slave, but my name is secret. And here it is to be noted again that we are commanded to keep holy the Sabbath day, and we do hardly know when it comes for our taskmasters are as hard with us as the Egyptians was with the children of Israel. God be merciful unto us. Here follows our severity and sorrowful service. We are hard used up on every account. In the first place, we are in ignorance of our salvation, and in the next place we are kept out of the church, and matrimony is denied us. And to be plain, they do look no more up on us than if we were dogs, which I hope when these strange lines comes to your lordship's hands will be looked into. And here we beg for Jesus Christ, his sake, that as your honour do hope for the mercy of God at the day of death, and the redemption of our Saviour Christ, that when this comes to your lordship's hands, your honour will take some pity of us, who is your humble but sorrowful petitioners. And sir, we, your humble petitioners, do humbly beg the favour of your lordship, that your honour will grant and settle one thing upon us, which is that our children may be brought up in the way of the Christian faith. And our desire is that they may be learned the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the 10 Commandments, and that they may appear every Lord's Day at church before the curate to be examined, for our desire is that godliness should abound amongst us, and we desire that our children be put to school and learn to read through the Bible, which is all at present with our prayers to God for its good success. Before your honour, these from your humble servants in the Lord. My writing is very bad. I hope your honour will take the will for the deed. I am but a poor slave that write it, and has no other time but Sunday, and hardly that at sometimes. September the 8th, 1723. To the Right Reverend Father in God, my Lord Archbishop of London, these with care. We dare not subscribe any man's name to this, for fear of our masters. For if they knew that we have sent home to your honour, we should go near to swing upon the gallows tree.
That's one of the recordings that I find it, whenever I listen to it, it's very moving. We don't really know if it was ever answered. There's no surrounding correspondence, so that's just a single letter bound into the volume of correspondence. Wrongly, it was bound into the correspondence from Jamaica when it was sent from Virginia. We don't really know why. Now you can see the second quite interesting item that was on display. That was 40 years later, and it's a petition written on behalf of Esther Smith. She, her enslaver opposed her baptism, and she was pleading to Archbishop Secker to be baptized. And at the same time, she was trying to find escape from being sent to work in plantation. There is a sort of surrounding correspondence. She was trying to obtain a baptism at St. Alphag's Church in Greenwich, London, and there were a few people who were trying to help her, including the church's vicar, Samuel Squire, and then a Methodist prison visitor, Silas Todd. Archbishop Secker sought legal advice from Philip York, first Earl of Hardwicke, who confirmed then that a slave brought to England is still a slave, and baptism wouldn't change Esther's status. As I say, I'm more than happy to share the full transcription and then the reading of that letter with you as well. But I understand we're pressed by time, so I'll move to the next item, which is a correspondence relating to the case of Betty Cudjoe. This sort of touches upon the subject of marriage between the enslaved people and free people. In this case, an enslaved woman, Betty Cudjoe, wanted to marry a William Harris, who was a free man. However, the attorneys of her owner, of the Fannells plantation, they found out that that was the parish of St. Anthony, Montserrat. Betty's enslaver decided to take action when they discovered that she was planning to marry William Harris. The first bans were published in the church, and the rector was in favor of the marriage. However, the attorneys demanded that the Reverend Lacock should not publish any further bans on the grounds that such a marriage would would affect the economy of the estates that own Betty. They claim that in general it would destroy the lawful owners' rights for the enslaved people. The surrounding correspondence proves that actually the rector had to yield to the demands, and then he withdrew the bans from the church for her.
To the Reverend Benjamin.
There's another letter which I thought was quite interesting, and I played the voicing of it because it shows the life on the plantation and then the views of the, I would say, enslavers. That's the letter written by Joseph Bartram, who arrived on St. Kitts in, I think, 1828. Just to sort of contrast it with the previous plea. Just to warn you, it does contain language that you might find
St. Kitts,
racist.
Middle Island, January 14th, 1820. My lord, under the blessing of divine providence, I arrived here safely after a voyage of 6 weeks, and was most kindly received by His Majesty's representative at his place, Governor Maxwell, who directed my presentation to be immediately made out. For your lordship's most gracious letter to His Excellency, I beg leave to return my hearty thanks. Your lordship will not expect that I should be able, after so short a residence, to give anything like a particular account of the religious state of the island, but there are one or two points so exceedingly prominent that they must soon be noticed by an attentive observer, and from the communication with which your lordship honoured me, I am persuaded they concern matters which you have much at heart. The first I will mention regards the practicability of instructing the negroes from the pulpit. I confess, from what I have seen, and from what I have heard, I have very little hope of much instruction being efficient in the present state of the Negro population. Scarcely a fragment of their number Laura insists the church, and I fear those who do, that they acquire little beyond the knowledge of a few names to which they attach certain superstitious ideas. Lying, stealing, and fornication I understand to be almost universal among them, and scarcely, if at all, to be considered by them. If it be not presumptuous of me, my lord, to speak, with my degree of pointedness I would describe this neural depravity and ignorance of what they want of early instruction. The young negroes are not even taught to articulate their words with tolerable distinction, so that it is next to impossible for a newcomer to understand words they say. At least it is my care, and they appear to me to talk gibberish resembling that which I have heard the Irish people talk in the streets of London. Much less have they a supply by which they compress their ideas with any degree of precision. They appear to me to be practically strangers to our language, and to have the intellect only so far exercised as to serve them for the supplying of the wants of the body, and for the exertion made upon it. That the cure might be widely different is proved from what is now going forward in the house of the Speaker of the Assembly, who is one of my parishioners, and with whom I have had the honour to reside for a short time while the rectory house is repairing. I believe this gentleman first attempted the instruction of his older negroes, but was obliged to give up the task after a considerable trial as hopeless. His lady, with the assistance of a superior European servant, is at present daily engaged in the instruction of the children and youth of both sexes, and this without any hindrance of their appointed labours in what is called picking grass or in tending cattle, the children being taught early in the day, after they have brought their bundles and breakfasted, and the youth in the evening, when the labours of the day are over. About 1 hour and a half in the time devoted to each description. Thus educated, they appear as intelligent as young whites. Their memory is very good, for they readily acquire whatever it is wished they should commit to memory, by simply repeating it to them a few times over on successive days. Indeed, such is the advancement of the older ones, that they already know sufficient to qualify them for confirmation, supposing them spiritually to understand what the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the 10 Commandments signify, that a similar line of conduct should be pursued generally by propitiation of estates, is not in the course of human nature to be expected. But I apprehend this example proves there is no deficiency of understanding in these descendants of Ham, and that the establishment of national schools would be far more effective than any other means, that it is indeed the only means of rescuing this unhappy race from the present state of guilt and darkness. Another thing which has struck me very forcibly is the present cohabitation of the free half-coloured males and females, without any religious ceremony interposed to sanctify their union. I may possibly be quite wrong, but at present it does not seem to me simply to proceed from the wish to enjoy a licentious liberty. I believe the fact to be that many pass their whole lives together in a very reputable manner, and I hardly know how to treat some instances of this kind which have fallen under my observation, otherwise than as marriages. Whether the fees attending marriage in these countries have proved a check to the solemnization of it amongst this description of people must be for persons of more experience than myself to determine. The fees are certainly very high, and the misfortune is, they are too proud, I am informed, to submit to the publication of bans. The mulattoes are apparently an industrious, acute race of people, competent to all the ordinary business of life, and some of them rising here to considerable importance as commercial men. With the acuteness, however, of the whites, I wish I could consider them as deficient in the vices of the blacks. I am confident your lordship's desire to promote true religion and morality throughout your widely extended diocese will excuse my attempt to convey information which perhaps your lordship already possesses from sources of much greater authority. My ignorance of the post office regulations regarding foreign letters and the heat of this climate, which now in the winter is greater than in most English summers, prevent my using the accustomed external marks of respect, but I can assure your lordship that my heart is full of gratitude and veneration when I subscribe myself your lordship's dutiful and much obliged servant, J.R. Bartram. Mr. Pemberton arrived this very day.
So as you could hear, I would assume this letter is full of contradiction, but we can discuss that later. This next item was one of the other highlights of the exhibitions, which is called so-called the Slave Bible, and it was published on behalf of the Society for the Conversion of Negro Slaves. This version was published a year after the trade in enslaved people was abolished, so it's 1808, and 4 years after the successful anti-slavery revolution in Haiti. Formerly it was called a Bible, but whereas a standard Protestant Bible contains 1,189 chapters, this version contains only 232. And it excludes 90% of the Old Testament and 50% of the New Testament. Many references to freedom and escape from slavery was removed, and some passages encouraging loyalty and submission to masters were emphasized, for instance, like you can see in here. For instance, the text skips directly from Genesis 45:28 to Exodus 19. So it includes the 10 commandments, but the first 18 books of Exodus in which the Israelites escape slavery in Egypt have been removed. There is a discussion about it. Again, I'm more than happy to send to those interested links to various blog posts and online content that contain the discussion. But it's I think it really says a lot, that item. Just a few more. So I've mentioned Morgan Goodwin. That's the image of one of his publications. He was one of the first you could call abolitionists. He voiced his rejection of slavery in 1680s, when there were very few voices against that at that time. He was a minister who had witnessed the barbarity of slavery in Virginia and Barbados. And then when he came back to England, he devoted himself to fighting for abolition. His last published sermon was Trade Before Religion, and it was addressed to King James II and delivered at Westminster Abbey and other churches across London. He compared enslavement and trade in enslaved people to the pact with the devil. So he said, we have exceeded the worst of infidels by our first enslaving and then murdering of men's souls. For how can it be endured that a nation once so famous for zeal and piety should prostrate herself to that foul idol Mammon and worship trade? And after preaching that, he vanishes from historical records. We don't know what happened to him. Just to illustrate the opposition to the abolition, is this little pamphlet from much later, from the 18th century. It's by Raymond Harris, who was a Jesuit expelled from Spain and later banned from ministry in Liverpool. He wrote that pamphlet called Scriptural Researches in Licitness of the Slave Trade, on commission by the Liverpool Corporation, who was linked to the enslavement. And he also, and this corporation organized 12 petitions against the abolition of the trade in enslaved people. They were signed by over 11,000 people then. And then he uses the typical arguments from that time to justify enslavement. So basically as something that had existed since biblical times, and then that practice was supported by the scriptures, and that formed part of the divine order. Other pro-slavery arguments used in the document were the abolition might lead to the decline of the British economy, and the plantation owners were a civilizing influence on the enslaved people. These are the highlights. I can just show you, we had a visitor book that these are the comments. The opening of the exhibition was, we were honored to have the Archbishop of West Indies and the Archbishop of West Africa. These are the comments they left. I think in general, the exhibition met with positive response. I'm very interested to hear what you think about whatever I showed you. Just very briefly, because I know we are running out of time, just to show you a few further items from the collections that we couldn't really use in the exhibition. So we have several printed books that illustrate the atrocities of enslavement, and then archives. I would say if you wanted to do research, I would say probably the best place to look in our collections would be the so-called Fulham papers, so the archive of the bishops of London, who at that time oversaw the structure of the church in the colonies. So it's a great resource for the early history of the Caribbean and also the colonies in America. This particular item relates to the Codrington Estates plantation in Barbados, and then I think that's the letter from Charles Bolton to Philip Beecroft from 1741. He accuses his predecessor of various malpractices, as you can see, including cruelty to the enslaved. There is a transcription of the bit that you can see. And another sheet showing the income and expenditure of the Codrington plantation in Barbados between 1737 and 1743. These are statistics, but also you can find in another collection called the Christian Faith Society collection, papers relating to the slave population in Caribbean, and then you get the names. And then I think this bit shows in some way personal histories of these people, so you can really tell what really happened to them. Again, this is available either via our online image database, or we could provide copies. Some further resources, and I'm happy to share with whoever's interested, is this. We've got the research guide is available through our website, and it's research into the Black, Asian and other minorities history in Britain. And then I would really encourage those interested to use our online catalog. These are two catalogs. So one for the printed books, which is the archives, database of archives and manuscripts, with information on how to use it easily to be found there, and then the printed books catalog as well, and that's the screenshot of our image database, where you can look at and then research the digitized archives. I think I would finish with that. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting, and I stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to note that Georgia Boone there from your colleague at the archives is connected if you want to turn to her, but we also have Bishop Peter Fenty as well. So however you'd like to proceed.
Easter greetings. I thank the Trinity Divinity Alumni Associates Executive for their invitation to participate in this conference and appreciate the opportunity to do so. I am grateful for the Lambeth Archives exhibition as presented, and it was really good last week having a conversation with Christoph before this presentation. As I looked at the topic colonialism and the Anglican Church, the first thoughts that came to my mind were the more things change, the more they remain the same. I come to this conversation as a citizen of the former first Black slave colony of Britain, Barbados. I grew up under the Union Jack, under colonialism, and my childhood and early adult experience was that of colonial indoctrination through educational, social, political, and religious systems. I am a cradle Anglican and was prepared for ordained ministry at Codrington College, Barbados, which is situated on one of the former large slave plantations on the island, owned by Christopher Codrington, a colonial administrator, slave owner, and military officer. Barbados was the first Black slave colony of the British and remained under British rule from 1625, when Captain John Powell claimed the island on behalf of King James I until its independence in 1966. The establishment of an exhibition such as this, showing the history of the slave trade and slavery, is a reminder of the cruelty and inhumane institution of slavery. One cannot view the Lambeth Palace exhibition and not be moved and disturbed by what we see. It is my hope that our conversation will not be mere words, but our willingness to do something about redressing the wrongs done in the name of Christianity by our church, and to acknowledge the pain that our Black brothers and sisters still experience because of the legacy of colonialism. This must include working together towards the elimination of Black anti-racism. The slave trade and slavery were about economic wealth, political domination, and religious indoctrination. The exhibition tells the troubling story of the Church of England's involvement in the slave trade and slavery. We see the documents as presented today. We see rare documents, pictures, letters from the enslaved people themselves that are not really known by most. We also are aware of the contrasting views on the rights of enslaved people from within the church and from missionaries working in the Caribbean and Americas. It is evident that many slaves protested their enslavement and appealed to church leaders for their freedom to be baptized or married, only to be ignored. The reality was that bishops and parish clergy were themselves slave owners. No wonder then that some clergy used the Bible to justify enslavement, while other clergy opposed it. You heard early on that a cleric by the name of Morgan Godwin, who witnessed the barbarity of slavery in Virginia and Barbados, on returning to England, preached about what he saw. And as you also heard things about him, his sermons just vanished. The slave trade and slavery have been regarded as a human tragedy. Historians, politicians, theologians, and other religious leaders, and many others, describe this phenomenon as the greatest crime against humanity in what is now defined as the modern era. When we view the mode of transportation and the way the slaves were transported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, it is heart-wrenching. The slaves were packed in the vessels like a tin of sardines. It is further appalling to learn of the treatment of the slaves on the plantations, the long hours of work required by the slave owners. Many of these plantations were owned by Anglican clerics. The transatlantic journey saw the loss of thousands of African lives, including those of children. It is critical to note from the perspective of the slave owners, masters, that African slaves were not regarded as humans, but chattel. In Barbados, in 1661, there was a comprehensive law called an Act for Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes, which was defined, that is, Africans were defined as heathens and brutes, not fit to be governed by the same laws as Christians. The legislators defined Africans as non-human, a form of property to be owned by purchasers and their heirs forever. This slave code was used as the template for other slave laws across the Caribbean and became the model applied to slavery. We may well ponder on how much this view of African slaves has persisted through the centuries to this day, giving rise to anti-Black racism and profiling. We may also ponder about what negative designations are given to things Black, like Black Book, Black Sheep in the Family, Blacklist, and we can name many others. Colonialism and the Anglican Church's involvement in that enterprise shows the very close relationship between church and state. The European powers in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries were earnestly engaged in imperial expansion and growing their economies. It can never be overstated that Europe's economic development was funded by an inhumane system. Europeans made their wealth on the backs of enslaved African people. The role of the Church of England in the transatlantic slavery economy was deliberate and in full support of colonial exploration, exploitation, and empire building. Any conversation about the slave trade and slavery must include an acknowledgement that government and church were fully invested in the enterprise of imperial expansion and the enslavement of African people. The Church of England, being the state church, played a crucial role in the imperial expansion, ownership, treatment, and indoctrination of enslaved African people. Colonialism required significant labor to develop the new colonies, and African slave labor proved the cheapest. It is also interesting that the role of the Church of England in the transatlantic slavery economy is described by some as complex and varied. While that may be so, there is much evidence that shows the Church of England knew what it was participating in and did what was expedient as an ally of the British monarchy. There is no denial that there were clergy, politicians, and others vehemently opposed to the slave trade and slavery and made their opinions known. Among such persons was William Wilberforce, the well-renowned abolitionist who confronted bishops in England about their support of slavery. Wilberforce was even cautioned and threatened about his views, but he persisted. Britain's wealth, which includes that of some of the parish clergy and bishops of the Church of England, came from the profits of slavery. The Bishop of Exeter owned 665 slaves. In Barbados, the Reverend John Brathwaite was one of the largest slave owners on the island, having been listed as owning 265 slaves. And those are just two examples. We may note that indentured labor or servitude was replaced by African slavery, which proved to be more profitable for very obvious reasons. Indentured servants were not regarded as property, and after serving an agreed time, could obtain their freedom, unlike the African slaves. African slave labor was more attractive to the colonizers and the large landowners who had invaded the colonies and needed the land to be developed. It is reported that in the British House of Commons on March 20, 2007, during a debate marking the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, a female member of parliament, a Black female member of parliament, Dawn Butler, during that debate said, and I quote, "I am happy that we are having this debate. We must never forget that the British economy was built on the backs of those who suffered in slavery. End of quote. Another parliamentarian in that debate also said, and I quote, "The slave trade was at the center, not the periphery, of the British economy. It was something in which all parts of British society were implicated, and it was the basis of the prosperity of the church, and one should add, of the royal family." End of quote. It is very evident that the Church of England and the state benefited significantly from trading in Black bodies across the Atlantic Ocean and in establishing slave colonies in the name of the British Crown. Ambassador A. Sherman Peter, permanent observer of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, to the United Nations, writing in the UN Chronicle, stated, and I quote, "It is now universally understood and accepted that the transatlantic trade in enchained, enslaved Africans was the greatest crime against humanity committed in what is now defined as the modern era, in terms of its scale and its social, psychological, spiritual, and physical brutality, specifically inflicted upon Africans as a targeted ethnicity. This vast, profitable business and the considerable subsequent suppression of the inhumanity and criminal nature of slavery was ubiquitous and usurping of moral values." End of quote. I have intentionally quoted Ambassador Sherman Peter because even to this day, there are many who do not acknowledge that the African slave trade and slavery was the greatest crime against humanity in our modern era. In his book, Capitalism and Slavery, Dr. Eric Williams, the first Prime Minister of the Twin Island Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, renowned as the father of the nation, and who led his nation to independence on August 31st, 1962, and as a republic August 1st, 1976, he wrote, and I quote, "The Negro slave trade became one of the most important business enterprises of the 17th century. Negro slavery was essential to the preservation of the sugar plantations. The consideration was purely economic. The slaves were regarded as Black ivory." Any conversation about our present subject must also recognize and address the matter of reparations, and not just monetary, as critical as that is, but in the broader context of righting wrongs. A simple definition of the word reparation is the act or process of making amends for a wrong. It is suggested that reparations may include restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. I hope that in our conversations today, we may talk a little about reparations. Sir Hilary Beckles, currently the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies and Chairman of the CARICOM Reparations, has called on the European Parliament to end colonialism in the Caribbean and honor debt owed. Sir Hilary, in speaking to an international panel on December 2nd, 2020, discussing the poverty legacies of colonialization, he reminded the audience that Europe's economic development was funded by a brutal and inhumane system of wealth extraction from the Caribbean, leaving the region impoverished and unable to meet its economic development targets. He emphasized that the Caribbean remains one of the few colonized regions in the world, and that Europe's legacy is one of the continuing economic exploitation and politics of white supremacy. Sir Hilary also pointed out that the Caribbean, since pushing for its independence, has taken full responsibility for its future, but noted that the responsibility and accountability relationship is a two-way process. He stated that Europe walked away from its obligations after committing heinous crimes against humanity in the region, stripping it of its natural resources and enslaving people. There are varying views of what reparation means, as well as those who do not believe that there is any need for reparations. I believe there is, and the Church of England must be a significant partner in such conversations. I also conclude by suggesting that as a result of colonialism, the Caribbean peoples were seriously impacted by colonialism in many and varying ways, including its education, culture, lifestyle, and many other aspects of our lives. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Johan Tapala, and I'm the curate at St. John's, Norway. I'd like to invite Georgia Boone at this point, if she could unmute herself and tell us a bit about herself and give us a brief introduction.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me along today. It's a real privilege to be with you all this afternoon. So I joined the Church Commissioners. I'm going to explain a bit about what the Church Commissioners is in a second as well, in mid-December. And I have a broad role around planning and engagement. At the moment, my main focus is facilitating, and I use that word very deliberately, and we'll come on to that as well, the Church Commissioners' work to respond to what it learned about its links with transatlantic chattel slavery. That link comes primarily through the endowment fund that the Church Commissioners manage on behalf of the Church of England, a significant proportion of which was historically invested in the South Sea Company, as Chris has already covered. So the reason that distinguishing between the church commissioners and the wider church is important is because from a governance perspective, those two parts of the organisation are run quite differently. And I think one of the things I'm keen to emphasise about the work going forward is that the work that's being done currently only addresses the links through the endowment fund. It doesn't address the full scale of the theological, spiritual, political, social endorsement and in many cases active encouragement and support of the horrors of the transatlantic chattel slave trade. So we're quite constrained at the moment to what we're looking at. So my job is to try and ensure that the response to what the church commissioners have learned is shaped by people from communities directly impacted by the transatlantic chattel slave trade. So it's kind of a weird position in that I'm trying to disempower the organisation that I work for and empower communities that the organisation I work for has harmed historically. So that's just a little bit about me, and I'm really happy to talk more, answer questions, whatever's helpful to the work.
Thank you, Georgia. So at this point, we will go into our question and answer period. If the attendees today can find the Q&A button on Zoom and fire away any questions that may have arisen during any of the conversations this morning, I will then start presenting them to our panelists. Our first question has come from Jason McKinney, and it is for Bishop Fenty. And the question is as follows. You referred to the need for the Church of England to engage in the work of reparation. Is there a role for the Anglican Church of Canada in this process?
I believe it is. Canada is a recipient of many former people out of the Caribbean. And because we are living in Canada does not mean that our history or past history was left behind. We in Canada also experience some of the same kind of issues as those of our brothers and sisters back in the Caribbean around racism, the way we're regarded by some folk as a people coming out of that experience. And therefore, the church in Canada has also to address how, as a former colony itself, many of the atrocities experienced, not barbaric as was in slavery, but many of the practices of discrimination many of us have been subjected to needs to be addressed. And I could speak about a whole host of things, including certainly in the earlier days when many of our Black clergy coming out of the Caribbean found it very difficult to find parishes in Canada, and in some instances were not appointed to parishes simply because of who we are.
Thank you, Bishop Fenty. At this moment, I don't see any other questions coming through.
So,
Bishop Fenty.
So I would like to ask of Georgia, do you have any sense of the percentage quantity of funds that the church commissioners now have resulted out of the slavery experience?
That is a great question, and it is one that I'm often asked, and it's one that is I think genuinely impossible to answer at the moment. But I can explain a little bit about why that is. So there's really three reasons why we can't put a number on that at the moment. The first is just simply to do with kind of financial equivalence. So if we simply look at the amount of money that was invested in the first place and try and do the kind of the financial equivalence, that's tricky in itself. So that process is tricky. That there are ways to, you can kind of make a decision, right, on which methodology you're going to use. So that we can kind of park that. The second debate is again something that I think personally is questionable, but it's one that people are considering, which is about the actual gains of the investment, and that is really hard to quantify. So just to give you a sense of how hard the ledgers were to work with, not only are they full of errors, but there's also a big gap where there was an unscrupulous chair of the fund or an unscrupulous treasurer. Chris will be able to correct me, and all the records just didn't get kept because this guy was embezzling stuff. So the actual quantifying of how many gains were made is really hard. The other reason it's difficult is because some of the money was also invested in land, and tracking those land investments is really almost impossible. We have had a go, but it's really, really complex. So unfortunately, and I guess it speaks a bit to the kind of complexity of the financial systems, even at that time, it's not possible to put a number on it. But it might be worth saying that the decision on the £100 million wasn't made to try and reflect a relative value either historically or now. It was made as a kind of starting point of money. So I don't think the commissioners see that as the only money they will ever put into this work, but they knew that if they looked at that number, they would be able to use it. And I think also the commissioners looked at comparable funds, comparable sizes of organisations, and tried to locate an appropriate value within that. So it's more about having the right fund for today rather than trying to do an equivalence. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia, and thank you, Bishop Fenty, for that question. I have another question from Alison Kemper, and I will click on the answer live. And she writes, in this remarkable book, and I believe the book she's referring to is Accounting for Slavery, Masters and Management by Rosenthal in 2018. And she writes, I learned of the complicity of the church in managing and accounting for enslaved labor. The Church of England selected those who were most compliant to baptize their children. Do you have any assessment of this involvement? Are any church historians working on this aspect?
So I wish I could say yes, all of that research has been done, but sadly it hasn't. What I can say is that some of the fund that we've determined will be available for further research. And I think if I could, I think having a really clear theological and historical account of every part of the involvement is going to be essential in order to move us on. But we're not there yet. Chris, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
I think you covered it perfectly, Georgia. I think research definitely is needed, and I'm not aware of any church historians doing research in exactly that direction. But the resources are here and they're available. And then I think anybody who's interested is welcome to do that. Also, to scope the assessment of that involvement. Just to mention that when Georgia mentioned that the ledgers, it all has been digitized, so you are able to look at them online. All those interested, and also the data was included in our online catalog, so you can search by place name and then the person's names to see, for instance, how much money was given to the Queensland Bounty Fund by an individual, or to which parishes it was invested. But as Georgia says, the process of tracking the exact amount is really complicated. As she said, we tried that, and then quite often you end up in a dead end line because the records are missing, or you need to do research in the local record offices where some documents are kept. Not everything is kept in one place.
I think the other thing I would add is that I think, yeah, just to re-emphasize this, what we're doing right now is a starting point. I think in a way, looking at the fund is we can do it through forensic accounting. You know, it's about ledgers and spreadsheets. Those are the easier. They're obviously still incredibly difficult and painful conversations to have. I think that one of the difficulties with the Church of England, as I'm sure you're all aware, is one of the things that makes it hard is it's very hard to track consistency. So it may be possible to show that, well, it is possible to show exactly what, I didn't get the name of the person asking the question, that, you know, there was intentional picking of vulnerable people. And it will also be possible to show people campaigning against that. And probably a minority, I should add, the majority of people were absolutely actively complicit and actively supportive. I think what's important is that we look at the corporate things that the church did as a whole, and we kind of start there. Having said that, when we look on a more local basis, I mean, even each cathedral in the UK has such a complex entanglement of history. It's, I'll just give you really, if you don't mind me indulging in time, I'll just give you one really quick example of kind of how much work there is still to do. So in Wells, I don't know if anybody knows where Wells is. I think it's the smallest city in England. It's really tiny. It has a really ancient cathedral. And that cathedral, although it was built long before the transatlantic chattel slave trade, when it started to run out of money, it was essentially financed by plantation owners, by UK plantation owners, for many, many decades. Not only that, but 10 consecutive deans of the cathedral were appointed from those very same families. So the entanglement is so deep and so pervasive. I think even when we just look at maybe the 42 cathedrals in the UK or the 16,000 church buildings just in England, sorry, I'm saying UK, I should say England, that's a huge amount of disentangling that needs to happen. And that's not to say it shouldn't happen, and I believe it will. I absolutely believe it will. However, I just don't want to oversimplify how much time and thought that's gonna take.
Thank you, Georgia and Chris, and thank you, Alison Kemper, for that question. I've got a question for both of you, Chris and Georgia, from Matthew Kieswetter. And the question is, what have been the responses of ordinary parishes and everyday Sunday churchgoers to the Church Commissioner's findings? Has there been significant opposition?
So the two, go on, Chris, do you want to start off?
No, go ahead.
The two questions that I always don't want to answer are A, how much exact money, because I can't answer it, and this question because it's so shameful. Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has received over 200 pieces of correspondence, and most of them are strongly negative. I myself have received scores of letters. Most of them are highly negative. Some of them are deeply offensive. It's really shocked me. I'm really surprised. When I came into post, I'm an Anglican. I go to church. I play the piano in church. And somebody on the project said to me, a lot of people within the church are going to object to this work. And I just simply didn't believe it. I simply didn't believe it, but I'm afraid it is the truth. And apart from where letters and correspondence are really so offensive, I would say they constitute a hate crime. I am responding to everybody in good faith. And I know that some may question that approach, but I think it's so important that, we're not just dismissing and dehumanizing people in turn. It's so important that we're kind of hearing and understanding and responding in good faith. And actually, I've had some okay successes with that. So I've had a couple of people where they've written to me, for example, classic letter will say, why are you looking at transatlantic chattel slavery and not all slavery? Why are you not looking at Roman slavery or Irish indentured? And, you know, and I write back in good faith and I tell them my honest answer to that. And actually, a couple of people have come back and said, hey, I didn't know that. Thanks. So I'm trying to be really faithful to trying not to dehumanize anybody, but I've got to tell you, it's been really hard and some of the letters are really, really upsetting. So having said that, there is of course a silent majority that are massively supportive and really proud of the Church of England looking at this. But yeah, it's been pretty harrowing, honestly. Chris, you've been dealing with the visitors to the library, so
yeah, I think the questions were very similar, and I think the one that was appearing quite often was why this amount of money has been allocated for that purpose and not for instance, saving the crumbling historical churches across England. That was one of the very often repeated arguments. And actually, I remember at the exhibition's opening, the Archbishop was going for another meeting, and he said in his speech that he's expecting to meet some negative comments and questions about that very thing. So I also remember a reaction from someone who guides around Liverpool and then the sites connected to the enslavement and slave trade, and he said that actually he thinks it's a first step in the right direction. And I think, as Georgia said, it's a first step. It's just the beginning of the journey, and then we'll see the fruits in the future. It's very early stage. I think the report, maybe to some extent, I hope the exhibition and then now the project is going to be the step in the right direction.
I've got another question from Andrea Don that is on the same vein as Matthew's question, but I wonder if you could speak to what she wants to know regarding what can you attribute to the negative responses. Is it just the $100 million cost of it, or is there something deeper going on that you can speak to?
So absolutely, I'm very, very happy to comment on that, and I'm sure that Bishop Fenty might have some thoughts on that as well, and as well as Chris. I guess, I mean, interestingly, the letters that I receive or the comments that Justin receives about the money are the ones that I kind of feel, you know, when I really delve into my sympathetic, you know, store. I can, you know, people are saying our church roof is caving in, or we can't afford a vicar, or, you know, and I think those letters are more well meant. Having said that, they are few and far between, and this is simply, you know, feeding into a culture war that is taking place, you know, I believe globally, but certainly in this country, fueled by the mass media, and in fact our very own government, who are refusing to answer questions about this matter in Parliament, and are using black and brown faces in a weaponized way to promote racist policies. So I think it's impossible to escape that polarization that is tragically taking place, and that absolutely fuels, I would say, 90% of the negative reaction. The fact that we've even looked into it is enough. Without the money, the fact that we're even talking about it is enough.
This is a very difficult conversation to have, and what we experience is that there are many who do not even want to talk about it, both white and black. But the reality is that what happened. And within the last decade, a number of prime ministers visiting the Caribbean were asked whether they would apologize for what had happened. And the responses were no. Let's put this behind us. We are friends. let's just look ahead and work together. And of course, denial of reality does not make for comfort of how do we move forward. And so there have been mixed responses to the conversation. And the reality simply is that many leaders, political, even religious, just do not want to deal with it. And there are those who wonder why, well, we're all getting along very well now, so what's the problem? But the problem is that we're not all getting along well, because many are still experiencing racism. And many still do feel that they have been wronged in ways in which there is a need to address those wrongs. So it is a hard conversation. We acknowledge it's a hard conversation, but it's not going to go away because we choose not to talk. But at least, hopefully, we can go forward in a loving way, acknowledging what has happened, but resolve that nothing like this must ever happen again. And how do we truly work towards putting right what went wrong?
Thank you all, and thank you, Matthew and Andrea, for your questions. I have a question from Miranda Sutherland from BC. How can education be reformed to provide a more accurate and comprehensive understanding of the transatlantic slave trade and its ongoing impacts?
If I can jump in, we need to look at curriculums across the academic community. If I may say, institutions just like the one that is sponsoring this, you need to look at what in your curriculum helps to inform your clergy living in a very different era about the effects of slavery in the community, about colonialism, about Black experiences. We need to have curricula that really seeks to better inform our peoples of many things that we have not addressed in our educational systems. So I would say it needs to begin with serious revision of curricula that addresses many of these topics that we are dealing with today.
I would fully agree, and I would say probably popularizing resources is a good step so that the researchers know where to look for, and then on speaking as an archivist on the archival side, making the resources more better cataloged, more available, much easier to understand, easier to search, so that whoever is looking for information is able to find it in much easier way. Digitization might be a good example when people have the records online and they can search them from their homes rather than traveling, for instance, to London or any local record offices in England to research. But there are many ways. I think also probably financing the repositories in the Caribbean, there are archives there. I'm just speaking purely from the archival point of view, so that they are able to preserve their archives and make them available in a better way than they are now. That's another step, because it's not only here, the records, it's also there. And then, yeah, as Bishop Fenty said, probably reforming the curriculum in schools, teaching about it.
Thank you both. And thank you, Miranda, for your question. I've got a question on the same vein of research and bringing things to light, but in terms of the Anglican Church Canada. And this question is from David Stewart. And the question is it known if anyone in the Anglican or in Anglican Canada owned a slave plantation?
this I don't know. I can't answer that question. I'm sorry.
I would look at any others on our conference to respond to that.
Yeah, I'm not aware. I think it probably would be widely known, but I don't want to say too confidently.
Me too. Yeah, I can't really. I mean, that's worth checking, but I can't answer. I'm sorry.
Maybe no slavery existed here as well, but I would want to be informed by someone who can speak with more authority on that.
Thank you all. And thank you, David. And I'm sorry we couldn't answer your question to the full extent. I've got a question in the chat that got sent to me by Charles. And he writes, good to see the reference to Eric Williams and the connection between capitalism and slavery. To what extent do you see connections between capitalism and modern day slavery or human trafficking as issues for the church to focus on in looking forward while not ignoring past horrors?
I think there is a link. Oh, go ahead, Giorgio.
Oh, no, please, you do go ahead, please.
No, I think there is a link. In fact, I think it may well be described as the other side of the other coin, of the same coin. And what we here in Canada can speak to about our own experiences. So yes, I think there is a link, and we need to. Our problem is that we have not informed ourselves, and we have not enabled others to be informed about many of these things. And it is important that we do so that we are better equipped to address and deal with these matters as we are confronted by them.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why this work was so important to the Church Commissioners, because the Church Commissioners' primary role is to manage the endowment fund, and they do so to incredibly high standards of ethical and in many cases impact investing, and have quite a strong voice on modern day slavery, and are members of several initiatives to combat that. I think that's one of the reasons why this was so important for us to look at. So we already play an active role in that area. I think that one of the interesting things is thinking about how what's happening now globally in terms of people talking about restitution is the impact that might have on the decision making of business leaders now and politicians now. There's a really interesting academic at the University of Birmingham who I was really interested in his motivation around the work. He's really, really passionate, and he's mapped all the different institutions that have been looking at this. And I asked him why he felt it was so important. And he said, he feels it's really important that people understand that people don't just forget these horrific abuses, and that there are consequences, and that he believes that will make a difference to decision making now, which I thought was quite an interesting view. I think the other thing that is so critical, aside from kind of economic models, is just the systemic racism that enables some of the unfair and unsafe labour practices to take place far away from where products are consumed. And I think that link should be acknowledged as well. But yeah, I mean, the Church Commissioners play a very active role in this, and I think our investment portfolio is testament to that now. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I've got another question from Mary, and it goes as like this. I'm a diocesan archivist in Manitoba, Canada. My question is, As archivists, how do we make records more available by description or digitization when archives of the church, at least in Canada, are so horribly underfunded? In many dioceses in Canada, there are no archivists, or the archivists are volunteers, or when professionally trained, are often part-time only. How do we get more funding for archives when parishes, like Georgia Boone said, are struggling to pay for their roof? Or to be cynical, as one of my archival studies professors once mused, does it serve the powers that be to underfund archives and keep this information hidden? It's a long one.
It's a very good question, and I, as an archivist, I fully understand what Andrea means. It's a difficult task to find funding. Here in England, what we do, I mean, you can ask for various external bodies for grants for particular cataloging projects, but I believe there might be other opportunities. Yeah, it's a very good point, and thank you for that. It is difficult, but I think it's worth trying, whichever way. Even if it's a single person trying to enhance the catalog, it's still worth putting. If you get the funds, I mean, everything goes around the funding, indeed. So, but still, putting an effort in what you do on everyday basis, just enhancing the catalog as much as you can really helps. Having the catalog and then making it available for the researchers. That's a great progress, even if it's a little step.
Would the Commissioners Fund be a source that could be tapped?
I would, yeah. Over to Georgia.
Maybe, but I don't know until our oversight group have done their work. But I'll definitely keep in touch with details. I guess the one thing I would say is that where organizations, institutions, or nations are looking into their past and looking to make restitution for it, I think, and we're trying to work as collaboratively as we can. We're always advising them that telling the truth is the most important part of this work, and in terms of repair, that is absolutely critical. So I think, if we were talking to an organization that knows it has a connection with the transatlantic chattel slave trade, we would advise them to not just think about financial restitution, but really make sure that they are resourced in order to really understand the full extent of their involvement.
Thank you all, and thank you, Mary, for that question. I've got a question for Bishop Fenty, and this is from Krista, and she writes, the history of empire seems to displace indigenous people to control new land and displace Africans to control labor to develop the stolen land. This is horrific, and we can't deny that the church was an ally in this. Thank you for your bravery as you expose the past harms. Bishop Fenty also said that part of reparations is to not repeat the horrors. Yet empire building continues, and it is happening again. Today, we see manufacturing of much of what is central to our Western way of life, are moved to places where destructive environmental practices and abusive labor practices, slavery, flourish. Is this what Bishop Fenty was talking about when he began with the words, the more things change, the more things stay the same?
Well, my experience is that despite the progress that we've made, we're living in a global village in which lots of things are seen to be done on a larger scale. And we see how multinational corporations and such institutions have mushroomed, and the way in which they impact on smaller enterprises. So in that context, we are vulnerable to the exploits of big things, and that will continue to happen. I mean, we see the amalgamation of a number of businesses that can only be described as wanting to hold on to more wealth or to greater power in order to control. And so as we think that we're doing better, we do have to ask the question, are we? Are we really better than we were 10, 15 years ago? Yes, there's merit in numbers, quantity, significant and critical mass, but I don't know that we are better served even by the growth and the way in which we have progressed through the years. We have a lot of questions about whether we are better off today than we were before. There's no denial that significant developments in all of our countries has made a difference. But on the other hand, many have not benefited. So the question is, what would meet that which will satisfy the majority for enhanced living? And so I think we have to recognize that things are still very challenging in this economic time. I want to make a comment, though not related to the last question. One of the things that we also know is this, which is a dichotomy about this topic. When Haiti became an independent colony as a result of the slaves uprising themselves and liberating themselves in 1801, and became the first Black independent country. It is remarkable that from that day until now, the oppressed had to pay the oppressors in order to have their freedom. And that continues to be a thorn in the flesh, in my opinion, in the way in which France still needs to do right by Haiti. Haiti is not the poorest nation on the earth voluntarily. It is by design, European design, and primarily as a result of the relationship with France. And that needs to be recognized as something very critical that do have some resemblances in other parts of the once colonized community. So I just want to put that out there, that it is scandalous that Haiti should be in the state of poverty that it is in now, when we consider what has happened over 100 years or more.
Which, in a sense, reminds me, I should have mentioned that when the slave trade was abolished, and then slavery was abolished, the compensation was paid to the enslavers, actually, to the owners of the enslaved,
That's
not
right.
the enslaved. And then that was a huge amount of money that I believe the last ratios were paid in the 21st century, actually. So that's another 2015. So it's and that was paid out from the budget of the United Kingdom. So and directly to the families of the enslavers, not the enslaved.
And the other point I would add to that is, and I know that there are those who hold the view that church and politics should mix, but hello, that is who we are. The Haitian situation, I think, is also scandalous with regards to what France and the United States of America did in taking out a legitimate leader in the President Aristide in order to satisfy what the French wanted to happen. And I make that point deliberately because even today, we see how governments manipulate situations to satisfy the constituencies that they want to satisfy. And that plays out across the world with regards to foreign policy, economic policy, and how it disadvantages many countries in the international community.
Thank you all. We've got 1 minute left, and we've got one final question from David Danner. And this is for Krista or Georgia, to say more about how the income from Queen Anne's bounty was expended beyond the support of impoverished clergy.
Well, initially, the Queen's Own bounty was created specifically for augmentations of livings of the poorer clergy, and that was that's what it was for most of its history. Initially, it was by buying a land from which the income would then support a living of a given individual benefice, a rector or vicar or whoever. Later on in the 19th century, they moved from that into investment into the actually parsonage houses. So we've got this resulted in a very rich archive we have here of the parsonage plans. Quite beautiful archival objects. And then, as I said, in 1948, it merged with the ecclesiastical commissioners to form the church commissioners. And then from then on, you can talk about some other aspects, which probably Georgia can say more. But it's a body that manages the assets of the Church of England in order to support the administration of the church, and then the church mission, so the ministry as well, and then administration of the church structure.
Yeah, and today it's essentially used for the same thing, so supporting poorer dioceses and mission initiatives, although the difference is the investment is also intentionally impactful in an ethical way. Excuse me.
The Queen's Own bounty at the moment is a defunct body. It's the predecessor of the church commissioners. It no longer exists since 1948.
Well, thank you all for answering these questions to the best of your abilities, and thank you all for those who presented your questions. And I apologize for any questions that may have come through that we haven't been able to address, but I hope perhaps in further conversations they will be. I will now hand it over to Matthew.
Thank you, Johan, and thank you to Chris, to Georgia, and to Bishop Fenty. And the bishop said that there are many that don't want to even talk about it, right? So I'm glad that we could have a space here where we can talk and learn and reflect together. And I'm also glad that Trinity College and its Faculty of Divinity is a place of formation. There was that question and conversation around the formation of people going forward. So I hope that the theological programs at Trinity can be a part of forming people for lay and ordained ministry that can step into the future participating in Christ's reign of justice with eyes wide open and having these conversations that need to be had. So thank you to all, and thank you to all that have been a part of this session one. Thank you, and on behalf of the Trinity Divinity Alumni Associates Executive and the Office of Development and Alumni Affairs, thank you to everyone who was a part of this morning's session. Reminder that although this is offered free of charge, as you're able or feel called, you're welcome to make a donation to support the Trinity College Divinity students' bursaries. Further information and links are on the Eventbrite page or the Trinity College website. In the next few days, there's going to be a survey about this conference, and we really would appreciate and benefit from your feedback and guidance as we look to future topics or future ways of providing learning opportunities. So we would like to hear from you. And if you are a Trinity Divinity alumnus, please, we would love if you would stay involved with the college and with the Divinity faculty. And we were so pleased that the first e-newsletter was put out just in the past week. If you received it, please pass it along to others whom you know that are part of the Trinity community, or check in with them to see if they received it. Or if you didn't receive it and would like to, please reach out to the college. We look forward to welcoming you to our afternoon session, which is at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And we hope that if there were any of those questions that we didn't get to, perhaps they could be resubmitted for that session. So thank you to all, and we wish you blessings on the rest of the day and a good lunch, and looking forward to seeing many back soon.
Thank you.
Yes.